Today's building block of faith is worship. Worship can be many different things, like coming to church, praying, gathering together, or probably most commonly known as singing praise to God. You can worship with many different people around you, or you can worship God by yourself. In today's story, we see how worshiping God impacted those around Paul. You will see Paul, a former enemy of Jesus, now turned believer, worshiping God while he is still in prison. Other people around Paul see his faithfulness to worship God while he is in the hardest struggles, and they become believers in Jesus too. What we learn in this story and in our activities today is that worship is anything you do that glorifies our real and true God.
That night, the soldiers and horsemen and spearmen escorted Paul to the city of Caesarea. At Caesarea, they presented Paul to Governor Felix. Felix said to Paul, "I will give you a hearing whenever your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be taken to the palace and kept under guard. Paul's enemies were angry when they found out that the Roman captain had sent Paul out of Jerusalem. After 5 days, the Jewish leader and a lawyer came down to Caesarea to present their case against Paul. The lawyer began to lash out against Paul, saying, "We have found this man to be a plague and a ringleader among the Nazarenes." Paul began to speak, addressing Felix with respect, explaining how he was a worshiper of God and honored the law of Moses. As Felix listened to Paul speak, he knew that the Jews did not have any real charges to bring against Paul. When Paul finished sharing his story, Governor Felix said, "When the Roman captain comes down, I will decide your case." He commanded a Roman soldier to keep watch over Paul, but he allowed Paul's friends to come and go as they pleased. Several days later, Felix sent for Paul. He and his wife wanted to hear the gospel of Christ. As Paul spoke, Felix became convicted of his own sin and began trembling. He said to Paul, "Leave me for now. When I have more time, I will send for you." 2 years passed, and still Paul was a prisoner in Caesarea. Felix had called for Paul often, hoping to be bribed to set Paul free. Even though he knew Paul did not deserve to be a prisoner, he refused to release him. As soon as the new governor, Festus, arrived in Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders began to tell him about Paul. They tried to get Festus to send for Paul. If Paul were brought to Jerusalem, they planned to ambush him along the way and kill him. But Festus said, "I'm going back to Caesarea. If you want to accuse Paul, come down to Caesarea." 10 days later, Paul was brought before Festus and the Jews in Caesarea. The Jews brought many serious charges against Paul, but they could not prove them. Paul made his defense against the charges and said, "I have not sinned against the Jewish law, nor the temple, nor against Caesar." Festus wanted to please the Jews, so he said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to be tried on these charges?" Paul replied, "I am here at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be tried. If I have done anything worthy of death, I am willing to die. I appeal to Caesar." Festus knew that every Roman citizen had a right to appear before Caesar, the emperor of the Roman Empire. To Paul's request, Festus had no choice but to reply, "You have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go." Before Paul was sent to Rome to appear before Caesar, King Agrippa heard about Paul's imprisonment and wanted to talk to Paul. King Agrippa listened patiently to Paul's testimony of salvation and his explanation of the Jews' persecution. When Paul had finished, King Agrippa said, "Paul, you almost persuade me to be a Christian." "I wish I could persuade not only you, but everyone here," Paul replied. As King Agrippa, Festus, and the others left the judgment hall, King Agrippa said to Festus, "This man has done nothing to deserve death or even imprisonment. He could be set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." God had a plan to spread the gospel through the Western world, and Paul was part of that plan. Paul was willing to do whatever God wanted him to do and was not frustrated when he was put in prison. God used Paul to spread the gospel to the Western world, and the effect of the gospel can still be seen today. Sometimes we look at situations and see problems, but God has a plan that often we cannot see. We can get a glimpse of some of the reasons God allowed Paul to be imprisoned. Paul was protected from those who wanted to harm him while he was in prison. Paul wrote the prison epistles while in prison: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Because Paul appealed to Caesar, Paul was able to be a witness in Rome and even to the Roman emperor. Paul shared his testimony of salvation many times in these chapters of Acts. This is a reminder to us to be ready and willing to share our testimony of salvation. Some people who won't listen to anything else about God will listen to your testimony. Be ready to share your testimony of salvation.